Hello, and welcome to episode 24 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Nick Zoutra. I am very pleased to welcome our guest today, Dr. David Baker, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Michigan. David's main interests within the field include philosophy of science, foundations of physics, moral philosophy, and metaphysics. David's research is mainly focused on clarifying the ways in which scientific discoveries are described. He sees himself as investigating what science has discovered and how it can be justified. His primary focus is on the ontological implications of dynamical symmetries, especially in quantum field theory. Other topics of interest include quantum statistics, the structure of classical and relativistic spacetimes, antimatter, and the many worlds interpretations of quantum mechanics. He is also interested in metaphysical and moral issues related to free will, responsibility, death, and mortality. Thus, without further ado, let's bring in David. Well, Dave Baker, Dr. Dave Baker, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this morning, afternoon?
Oh, not bad. Just relaxing, I suppose. I'm kind of, I'm at my family's summer place right now, so it's...
Where's the summer place?
Well, it's where I grew up, which is, in we say northern lower Michigan because it's the northern part of the lower peninsula. On Lake Michigan, close to Lake Michigan. So it's kind of the house is kind of between Lake Michigan and this smaller lake, Crystal Lake.
Oh, okay. Nice. How long have you been staying out there this summer?
I usually get about 2 months there a summer. It's nice for me, I like to sort of combine vacationing and writing. Typically, it's kind of a funny, So, you read sort of psychology articles about this flow phenomenon, right? Where you have these days where you sort of get caught up in what you're doing, and you sort of lose track of time. And I find that I can't, I guess it's normal. I can't control when that happens. So what I like to do is I kind of like start out working on some stuff in the morning, and then if it clicks, I keep working, and if it doesn't click, I go kayaking. So it's like it's kind of how or go for a hike or something, right? So that's kind of how I run things here.
Great. And is there other family or friends that are staying with you?
Yeah, I mean, another nice thing is that a large fraction of my family. So there's kind of the joke is that we have kind of an estate, which is not at all what it is. It's like, these are all like, regular middle class people, but my dad's family, the Bakers, had a cottage in this area when my dad was growing up, and then my parents. Or my dad's kind of generation of the family all built summer places basically right next door to the one that they grew up in. So, so two sets of my aunts and uncles are kind of right next door here. Oh. And then my brother and my sister and I also spend a lot of time staying with my mom and dad in this summer place during the summer. So it's kind of like a summer-long family reunion every year.
Wow. That's really something. And have you done this pretty much every year since? I mean, like you did this growing up, or is this kind of
Yeah, this was a lot of what it was like when I was growing up. I mean, I have some cousins who, especially I have one cousin who's kind of more like a sibling to me, more like a brother. Yeah, there have been a couple of exceptions. One summer when I was working at Fermilab, and when I was an undergraduate, when I was in college, I did not really come here. And then the summer that I was before I went on the job market in graduate school, I didn't really spend much time here. But besides that, I usually get a lot of time in.
Well, I'm excited to come back to see maybe it sounds to me that as far as just enjoying oneself and then perhaps doing some good work there, this has become a really good place.
Yeah. It feeds the sort of creative process, I think, as well as being an enjoyable place.
Excellent. Well, let's take a step back. I want to know. So you mentioned in the beginning that you grew up in northern Lower Michigan. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which town or area?
Well, the summer place is in Frankfurt, which is a small tourist town on Lake Michigan, which has a kind of little harbor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty close to the Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore, which is like the national park, the kind of big national park in Michigan.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So then during the rest of the year, we would go to school in Traverse City, which is about an hour away from Frankfurt. It's also on Lake Michigan, in kind of like, people do this thing in Michigan where you hold up your hand and you sort of, that's where, you point on the hand and that's where you're located in the Lower Peninsula, right? So Traverse City is basically kind of the tip of the pinky finger if you do that.
Yeah, I'm looking on the map right now. Okay, yeah. Oh, yeah, you're pretty far up, close to a Canadian border. Okay.
Yeah, but on the other side, on the Lake Michigan side of the state, and not the Canada side.
That's right. And so, how did you like growing up in Michigan?
I had a fantastic childhood. I mean, no complaints whatsoever. It's, both of the, Traverse is also a tourist town, although kind of a bigger one. Although it wasn't very big when I was a kid. So it's, I was kind of running around in the woods all the time and going to the beach all the time as a kid. It was pretty fun. I have no complaints whatsoever. I mean, it was, you come from a town like that and wind up in philosophy, you are probably going to have a childhood of kind of like feeling like a big fish in a small pond intellectually, right?
Yeah. So what was sort of the working climate there? What did people do? What did families? What kinds of professions did they take on? What were people expected to do there?
Well, there were a lot of professionals. It wasn't the kind of thing where it was sort of it wasn't the kind of thing where kids weren't typically expected to go to college or anything. I mean, there were a bunch of families I knew, and sort of other kids I knew where the expectation was that they wouldn't go to college. But, I was, my parents, my mom, well, they're both retired now, but my mom was a child psychiatrist who started out working at a state hospital in Traverse City. So, and then my dad was a lawyer for a while, though he was doing family practice law and getting into people's, messy divorces and stuff like that. And he hated that. So he actually ended up becoming a house husband, basically. But around when I was, I guess it must have been when I was like 7 or 8 or something, he quit being a lawyer. So my parents are professionals. So it was kind of a typical story in that sense where like the first generation are the doctors and lawyers and the next generation are the professors, right? Yeah, but so I guess the yeah, the main thing I was getting at was just not a gigantic town, but it's a big enough town. It had a large high school. There's a large graduating class of 800 or something at my high school, so it was.
Oh, that's quite big. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a large high school, so it was actually. I think I had a lot of people who, when I was a little kid, I think, I had kind of a chip on my shoulder about, sort of being the intellectual kid and everybody else was just, not that kind of thing, right? And then of course, when you're like that, people will make fun of you for it, and so I felt kind of bullied. It was a really, I was a silly kid, but
so when was this happening? I mean, was at 7 or 8 or in middle school?
Yeah, all through, up until like 7th grade, I think I was very socially unadjusted or whatever. But in high school, I had quite a group of friends who were, really smart people, and several who I'm still in touch with these days, but smart people and really sort of, it's high school, right? So if you're like that, you're kind of into different, silly counterculture things like reading the Beatniks and stuff like that. But, but one of my high school friends is a successful magazine editor, for example. He was working for the Atlantic for a while. I think last I heard he was working for Boston Magazine or something. I don't remember, but and a lot of my friends have gone on to be lawyers in the Chicago area from high school. So definitely, I definitely had a peer group growing up who I considered to be real kind of intellectual peers and fun people to sort of.
That's really something. I haven't. I've talked to a lot of folks about that, and it hasn't. I haven't gotten that. It seems like a lot of times that particular peer group might not come until university life. So I'm really interested. Yeah, how do you think that might have shaped or informed your ways of thinking now?
Yeah, I think it was mainly useful just to get used to arguing at a young age. If you're in philosophy, I think one of the things that just gets you primed for the job is a lot of practice having arguments with people about interesting questions, and I certainly did that in high school. So, one of the things that was certainly there when I was growing up was a fair bit of, religious faith among people I knew. And so I actually, I was never religious. I probably considered myself a believer until I was sort of midway through high school, but I spent a lot of time arguing with religious friends who were quite smart. And so that was something that really shaped my interest in philosophy. Eventually, one of the things that kind of got me into philosophy was an interest in philosophy of religion, actually.
Yeah. So during this time, as you arguing with friends, can you recall any, particular arguments that took place, or particular issues you found intriguing that you were challenging your friends on?
Well, I remember I was very enamored with the idea of determinism then, even though I didn't really know I didn't actually know any of the science, so I didn't know any of the reasons for or against it, but I found the idea really attractive. And so that was one thing. The other thing that I got into way before it was cool was that I was very, I don't know where I discovered this. I think it might have been in a book called The End of Work by Jeremy Rifkin, which was kind of, looking back at it, I think it's kind of a poorly argued book, but one of the things that he was arguing for was guaranteed minimum income in that. And I became really excited by that idea, and I like the idea of people being able to sort of decide whether they wanted to work, and if they didn't want to work, then they could have a life of freedom pursuing their hobbies.
Mm-hmm.
I guess kind of like what my life feels like today.
What many academics do, yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, so I spent a lot of high school sort of getting in political arguments with my friends, arguing that people should be, offered this kind of opportunity to choose whether they want to work, and that would be sort of what utopia would be like. So that was an argument that I used to have a lot when I was in high school. But it's funny, I was telling a friend of mine recently, it was a very different time, right? Because it was the 90s. So I thought of myself as very politically radical.
Mm-hmm.
My friend was like, "Well, did you do any kind of activist stuff?" And I was like, "No. It was the Clinton years, and everything seemed so good that I sort of just figured that inevitably my utopia would come about." So I had no interest in sort of becoming an activist, because I just thought, like, hey,
enough just good arguments, and things are going to happen eventually.
I was very Hegelian, I guess you would say, right, at that age. I just thought, yeah, this is the future. It's inevitable.
That's great. That's
Sit
great.
back and let it happen.
Okay, so it sounds like you had a lot of differing interests in related to some core arguments and core issues in philosophy. Was it in high school that your interest in physics came about?
No, earlier than that.
Okay.
Well, my interest in physics came about pretty early. My knowledge of physics
Okay.
had to basically wait until college, but so I became interested in physics long before I knew anything about what it really involved.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew what I wanted to do from an extremely young age. I believe I was like 4 or 5 when I started saying to my parents that I wanted to be a scientist when I grew up. It was because of dinosaurs, really. I had all these dinosaur books that I loved, and all these dinosaur toys and stuff like that. Those were the days. there were these awesome. Excuse me while I sort of geek out.
Go for it.
I still collect toys to this day. I'm like a toy geek. So there were these toys called Dino Riders that you would get, where there were these guys who had traveled back in time to the the Cretaceous period or whatever, and they traveled back in their spaceships pursued by these aliens, and they would take these dinosaurs and train them and fit them out with this armor and laser turrets and stuff, and then so anyway, I love dinosaurs, and actually
I can see them. I just looked them up now. They look pretty cool.
They're awesome.
Were they based on a TV show? Or was it just
there was
the
a
toys?
Dino Riders show, but I did not watch it then.
Okay, but the toys themselves are...
The toys themselves, that was one of the things, a lot of the toys I liked came from TV shows, but with Dino Riders, the toys were so cool that I didn't even need to watch the show. I was just like, get me these. And my folks are fairly obliging, which I always thank them for. But so I was obsessed with dinosaurs. I knew all the dinosaurs' names and stuff and what they did. And I wanted to dig up dinosaur bones. And so scientists were the people who dig up dinosaur bones. So at first I wanted to be a paleontologist. And then, I think as a kid, I thought that archaeologists were the ones who dig up the dinosaur bones, which was a ridiculous confusion that I had.
Mm.
So I wanted to dig up dinosaur bones. And then I got older and I became interested in space. And I wanted to go on the space shuttle.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought if I was an astronomer, then I could study space and maybe be a mission specialist on the space shuttle someday. And then I got really into Einstein when I was 11 or 12. And I started thinking, well, Einstein was a physicist, so I want to be a physicist.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the one that really stuck, because I think I decided that I was really interested in kind of the nature of things, and I wanted to know about, fundamental reality, and so that really actually stuck with me.
Very nice, very nice. So, okay, so you're doing some of these things you're pursuing some of these interests, but you said your knowledge of physics actually didn't kick in until college. So, so making the transition to college, what was this like?
Yeah, there was some amount of difficulty, which was part of what led to my eventual kind of actual career, right? So we didn't have AP Physics in my high school. That was one of, like I said, it's a large high school. I suppose this is one of the places where it was more like a small town high school, is that there were some AP classes we didn't have. We didn't have AP Physics. Mm-hmm. So I didn't get a really rigorous schooling in physics. It just wasn't a great science and math high school at that time. My understanding now is that actually Traverse City has a great science and math program in their high school at this point. In fact, a couple years ago when I was on leave, I spent some time in Traverse around Christmas time, and one of the things I did kind of as a lark was to do Princeton alumni interviews in Traverse City for students who wanted to get into Princeton. And, the ones that I interviewed were all coming from this science and math program that they have there. So now they have this really big thing. But when I was a kid, that didn't really exist. So, I didn't take difficult physics until I was in college. Mm-hmm. And, so I took the honors physics introduction class when I was starting, and had a great professor who, is still one of my kind of science idols, this guy, Tim McKay, who I now see him. I was at the University of Michigan. I now see him around the halls at Michigan from time to time, or sort of in different events. It's always great to see him.
Great.
Yeah, he did a wonderful job teaching. And I took the class and I got an A-. And that was kind of the first warning sign, but I didn't really sort of see through it then.
So describe it. Yeah, A-. Some would see that as a good sign, but tell me.
I did see it as a good sign, actually, but I should have seen it as a warning sign. Because the thing was, I got an A- in a class that was taught by Tim, and Tim was a great teacher. Mm-hmm. And one of the things about, I think this is changing, but one of the things about physics education is the curriculum is not consciously, but kind of unconsciously designed so that in order to really succeed, you need to be the kind of student who can learn and do well, even when you're taught by a teacher who is not such a great teacher, because you're inevitably going to encounter somebody, who is kind of the stereotype of a physics professor.
Yeah, physics is notorious for, folks who are more researchers than professors at times.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So when it came time for me to take my first sort of 400 level advanced upper kind of undergraduate level class in physics, that time was also the first time that I really took a class from somebody who was really one of these, I'm a researcher and not a teacher type people. And it was tough because, let me tell you the setup, right? So the setup was I had taken the sort of introductory and intermediate classes. I was kind of, I think I was a first semester junior at that point. And one of the physics advisors had gotten in touch with me because I had a great GPA. I was taking all these humanities classes too and doing well in those, and I was getting, A's in my sort of lower and middle level physics classes. And so they got in touch with me to apply for this scholarship, the Barry Goldwater Scholarship, which is like this thing that the university nominates people for in the sciences. Mm-hmm. So I was like, this is cool. Like, I'm going somewhere. And then I took this 400 level class, and I got something in the C range. I think it was, I can't remember if it was a C plus or just a straight C, actually. Like, I did not do well. And so, so the physics advisor was really apologetic. She's a sweet, wonderful person who later taught me general relativity. Wonderful, wonderful professor. But, you know, she didn't have a choice, right? They had to not nominate me at that point because I had no chance. So, that was the point actually when I kind of realized that I would be way better at philosophy than I was at physics. Was that point?
So,
and
yeah.
Oh, go on.
No, well, I mean, it's interesting. I've had folks, and I know that were physics majors or dual majors in math and physics, and they unfortunately encounter the C or the D in these difficult math-based physics courses. So what did it tell to you in terms of maybe not being as successful in this particular course?
Well, I mean, I think what I realized was it wasn't that I realized I was kind of doomed as a physicist, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that would have been jumping to conclusions, although I don't think I would have had such a great career in physics. Just realistically, like, basically in physics, my comprehension skills are pretty good. Like I can understand physics pretty well. I think that's what's important to the work that I do. But doing actual kind of creative work is something that's kind of like I don't have a good sort of I don't have good mathematical intuition. Like I'm not good at sort of figuring out how to prove something, basically, like intuiting how do you do this proof, right? Guessing about how to do a proof. I'm not very good at that. So, just to be honest, right?
Yeah, sure.
So what I kind of realized was that I didn't have that ability to do good creative work in physics. And what I had hoped to do, at which every physics, every aspiring physics professor, not every, but like a lot of them want to do, is they want to go and be a theorist, right? That's the sort of, I think actually in my case, I had better reasons for wanting to do that than most people do. I think most people want to do that because it's kind of prestigious.
Sure.
And you get to work on your own rather than as part of a collaboration, at least to a greater extent. But the reason why I wanted to do is that I like abstract thinking and abstract work, and I wanted to sort of think about really fundamental questions and work on abstract stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that the kind of physicist that I was probably going to end up becoming was a high energy particle experimentalist, which kind of doesn't have that. The other thing that sort of convinced me to do philosophy was I did this work at Fermilab, which was super fun and really enriching, actually. Another person who I still run into pretty frequently, who has an interesting history of connections with philosophy, actually, is my undergrad research advisor, Dave Gertis. He's still at Michigan. He's a great guy, and he has these funny connections with philosophy because he was my research mentor as an undergrad, and then my colleague Laura Ritchie, another of the faculty at Michigan. Laura and Dave dated in college, so he's continually incredulous about how many philosophers he knows.
Nice.
Because the physics he does is not at all related to philosophy. He's not somebody who would normally. He's not one of these theorists. He's not somebody who would normally sort of be hanging out with philosophers. So anyway, but I was working for Dave, and I kind of realized that so much of the work was things like programming and sort of figuring out what was wrong with these circuit boards and stuff like that, and there was this aspect of it that was more like a trade than a scholarly pursuit.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really looking for just a scholarly pursuit.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that's pretty informative. And so the folks who do end up going on to do who remain particularly in physics, but then focus on theoretical physics. I mean, what would they do? And could you have still taken a path in physics but gone theoretical physics, or was it just not? I guess I'm a little.
Yeah, I just didn't have the chops for it.
Gotcha.
Because if you are a real theorist, like you need to. I mean, theoretical physicists don't prove theorems in the sense that mathematicians prove theorems. There's a lot less. There's a lot less sort of logical rigor in physics derivations, but you do have to have basically kind of a strong mathematical, intuitive problem-solving ability to do these derivations that theorists need to do all the time.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that was just not a skill that came naturally to me.
Understandable. So, okay, so therefore, was this the turn to philosophy at this point?
Well, I had already been taking philosophy, so I started taking philosophy my freshman year, and I was super hooked on it day one. Jamie Tappenden was my first philosophy professor, and I had just a blast in his class, and he was always a great mentor to me. And when I was in undergrad, I got lots of encouragement from him about my papers and how I was doing in that class. So that was a real ego boost. In life generally, I like to play to my strengths. So he quickly convinced me that philosophy was one of my strengths. And I think for the reasons I was talking about before, right? It kind of felt like stuff I was doing when I was having fun arguments growing up, right? It felt like this kind of fun on the side that I was having while I was doing physics, which was my real work.
Yeah.
And then eventually I was like, well, why can't I just have the fun? that could be my real work, and
sure.
Real work could be fun.
Yeah. So. Okay. So was this? Did you make the decision to go? Did you go to graduate school right after undergrad?
I did. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, no break at all.
And you went and you applied and were accepted to Princeton. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Very nice. Very nice. So what was Princeton like?
I really enjoyed my time at Princeton. I mean, anyone who has been to Princeton, lived in Princeton, will tell you that Princeton is boring. Mm-hmm. This is a plus and a minus, because obviously the minus is that you're bored, right? But so no worries about the minuses. But basically, the good news is that there's not that much for the philosophy grad students to do except do philosophy in one form or another, whether that's doing your work, which is very easy to do in Princeton. It's not hard to, anybody can procrastinate anywhere, but it's harder to procrastinate in Princeton than it is in other places because you don't have all these kind of exciting, like if you're living in New York, right, you don't have all these kind of exciting events going on all the time to drag your attention away from your work. And also, it's a small place. It's easy to get together with your friends. Your friends are probably the other philosophy grad students. And my cohort was this extremely tightly knit, fun, just wonderful group of people, all of whom I still adore and stay in touch with. So it was really fun and easy to just kind of hang out and just talk about philosophy all the time, nothing but philosophy.
Wow.
It was people would probably say it was intense, but actually it just felt like loads of fun all the time. So that was the great aspect of Princeton, was just people were around the department all the time and, having fun,
discussing with one another.
Yeah, it was really great. And like I said, a big part of it was the people in my cohort. It was a fantastic group of people who were just, we very, very quickly into our time there, we realized we were going to be kind of lifelong friends. So that was very special.
That's fantastic. And so I had spoken with you before our chat, and were actually recommended by perhaps one of your friends in graduate school. Was that Colin Klein?
Yeah, Colin was a roommate. I mean, Colin wasn't in my cohort. He was he was a couple of years above me.
Okay.
But yeah, Colin was kind of, by that time, Colin was almost the sort of, what do I want to say? He was like, Colin was like the sort of, eminent wise guru to the grad students who were sort of earlier in the program, I guess. That's probably a way to put it. So, but he also did philosophy of science, and there weren't very many people at Princeton doing philosophy of science then, so we had more in common research wise than most people. So we talked a lot about that stuff.
Yeah. So I imagine, and Princeton is known for being one of the top programs in philosophy. Not necessarily philosophy of science, but
more so now. I mean,
more so now. Yeah.
Yeah. They have. The thing is that, so my advisor Hans Halverson had just arrived at Princeton a couple years before I showed up.
Okay.
So he hadn't had the time to kind of, he'd had the time to have an amazing reputation as a researcher, but I was his first student. And I think, honestly, like, philosophy of physics is such a small field. My experience with him, I think, really led to Princeton attracting a lot of philosophy of physics grad students, because Hans was just an unbelievable advisor to me. He was just really, he just had endless amounts of time and interest set aside for my work, and very helpful thoughts about everything. And, I sort of, after I finished, I pretty candidly told people about the experience that I had. And I think that, people who were starting out kind of heard that and ended up, so there've been, Hans has had several other great students since then. Noel Swanson at UC Delaware, Thomas Barrett just finished this year in philosophy of physics from Princeton. Joe Rocchielli, who, unfortunately due to health reasons isn't very active in the field now, but is, a great philosopher of physics. Robbie Hirsch. So Hans has had a lot of great students, actually.
Wow. Okay. That's great. So, what I was also getting to, so it sounds like philosophy of science is quite prominent there. But just your experience working and discussing with a lot of other folks in philosophy there. So, how that might have shifted, or informed your perspective on and how to do philosophy of physics. It seems like, a lot of folks in the philosophy of science, they come from a lot of different paths. Sounds like, some folks start in the sciences and then work their way into philosophy. Some folks start in philosophy, work their way into the sciences. Some have some other kind of combination of the two. But yeah, what was your experience working with a lot of the philosophers? I imagine philosophers of language, philosophers of mind, et cetera.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think that starting in graduate school, interaction with people in core areas of philosophy has really affected me. And, nowadays I think probably, other philosophers of physics, certainly when I talk with them, I get the sense that they think that they probably certainly would say this about me. I get the sense that they think that I'm kind of like a wannabe metaphysician. That's absolutely true. I love metaphysics, and I think there would be times when I was in grad school. I think I started out with a lot of the same impulses that a lot of philosophers of science and philosophers of physics have about metaphysics, which is to say, like, oh, do numbers exist? Right? That's kind of a bad question. That's kind of a sort of meaningless question, right? Or a question that's kind of empty, verbal dispute or something. So I would start to kind of when I was in grad school, I would start to kind of make these complaints to my friends who worked in these fields. And then they would raise these extremely cogent objections to these kind of complaints that I was making. And, I ended up concluding that really, I suppose the place where I still maintain some of that old skepticism about these questions is just that I now feel like a lot of really fundamental metaphysical questions are extremely difficult or impossible to answer with the evidence that we have available. But I certainly became convinced that these questions make sense and that they are sort of like contentful questions. And, I think that's really had a huge influence on the way that I do philosophy. Because, I became a wannabe metaphysician, right? I started to think, these questions about fundamental reality, like real, sort of deep metaphysical questions about fundamental reality are real questions. And it's hard to know much about them, but the things that we do know about them probably have to come, or a lot of them have to come via scientific data. And so that was sort of how I started to see the role of physics in my work, I guess.
So what kinds of work were you doing at this time?
Well, so I started out just kind of basically, I think more than a lot of people, I kind of do a lot of different things at once, I suppose. The main thing that I was sort of trying to learn how to work on is algebraic quantum field theory, which is the thing that my advisor's main research project was on. But so we should certainly talk about that. But during the course of that, I ran across a bunch of other things that I became interested in. And I was still interested in the thing that I was working on with my thesis as an undergraduate, which is the debate between substantivalists and relationists about space-time, and in particular kind of how that debate changes if you have what's called a cosmological constant, which is something that seems like the universe does have, where space tends to expand all by itself. That is to say, like, the expansion of the universe accelerates.
Yeah. So could you describe the main tension between the substantivalists and the relationist approaches to space-time?
So this is one of the places that this is a good thing to raise here, because this is one of the places where metaphysical, basically where the clarifications of contemporary metaphysicians are really helpful in understanding the debate. Because so people have always thought of the substantivalist relationist debate as being about whether whether space exists or not, right? Now, one thing that many people have always said to that, and it's an absolutely correct thing to say as far as it goes, is, well, like, what do you mean exists, right? We use lots of thin notions of existence, and it's a little silly to say. So the relationist point of view is that, I guess to put it in kind of the old terminology, there's no such thing as space as the container of matter, but instead there are all these spatial relationships between material objects, and that's really what gives you the spatial facts, right? Of course, is it really right to say on that view that space doesn't exist? Well, why not, right? Why wouldn't you say that? We can say that, we can say that dollars and cents exist, even though those are extremely kind of cobbled together objects. We can say that nations exist, right? Why isn't it wrong to say that space-time exists in kind of a sort of figurative sense, at least on the relationist point of view, right? Mm-hmm. So really, it seems like what the disagreement has to be is that there's some literal sense of, or some extremely robust sense of existence that space has for the substantivalist and not for the relationist. And I think that in some work that she's been doing recently, Jill North is exactly right in applying this this very fruitful metaphysical concept of fundamentality to this question, and saying, well, really what the substantivalists and the relationists are disagreeing about is not whether space exists, but whether space is among the things that exist at the fundamental level, right? Or whether matter is, in a sense, kind of more fundamental than space, right? So I think that's the right way to think about the question, although when I was working on this stuff, that hadn't become clear to me yet, and it was more kind of, I know it when I see it, kind of understanding of what the question actually meant, right?
Sure. So did this work end up populating your main thesis for your doctoral work?
It wasn't part of my dissertation. I did publish it when I was in graduate school.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it ended up being in one of the Philosophy Science Association proceedings. So I presented at the PSA when I was in graduate school, my second year. So it was really just a side project. It had nothing to do with my dissertation. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that I worked on then that had nothing to do with my dissertation, although I still consider it to be one of my more insightful papers, really, I got interested in the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is, let me just say a bit about it, right? Sure. So in quantum mechanics, right, I don't know. Have you had a philosopher of physics on previously to talk about the measurement problem? Or I guess I'm not necessarily. I probably shouldn't assume that people have heard that episode, even if
maybe you can go ahead and describe. We might have discussed it. We've had one or two philosophers of physics on, but I don't. Yeah.
So in quantum mechanics, right? There's this puzzle about, of course, if you just do the math, basically, you run into the Schrödinger cat paradox, right? If you just do the math and work out what the theory says happens when a measurement is performed, something like, checking whether a radioactive atom has decayed yet or something like that, then the theory will say, well, the state becomes a superposition or combination of the atom decaying and the atom not decaying. And so then if you set it up so that a pointer goes to the right if it decays and to the left if it doesn't decay, or if you set it up so that a cat gets killed if it decays and stays alive if it doesn't decay, then those objects enter into a superposition as well, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the many worlds approach is a particular sort of answer to the puzzle of what this means. And this many worlds approach says, well, there's no reason to worry about these superpositions. Really what they are is you end up with multiple worlds, one in which the cat is alive, one in which the cat is dead. One world in which you saw one outcome, another world in which you saw the other outcome.
Yep.
And there's been a lot of great work done on this topic the last couple decades, and there's a really good case to be made that the many worlds interpretation is just what you get when you look at quantum mechanics and, take it seriously from a scientific realist point of view. And in particular, there's this process called decoherence, which leads the different parts of the state to be basically causally isolated from each other and behave kind of like classical worlds.
Huh.
So it's not all sort of top-down metaphysics. It actually looks really unsurprising, this many worlds picture, when you look at some details of how the physics happens. The big problem with it is probability, because there are not going to be more worlds for the more probable outcomes and less worlds for the less probable outcomes. In fact, in a lot of situations, the number of worlds are going to be completely disconnected or ill-defined, right? Because there's going to be some vagueness in what counts as a world. But the bigger problem is not just that they're ill-defined, but that there's no correspondence between the number of worlds and which outcomes turn out to be more likely given the way that we do experiments and which frequencies we observe. So there's this whole project of looking at that problem and solving it, which is sort of started by the physicist David Deutsch, quantum information theory guy, and carried on in great detail and sophistication by David Wallace, as well as some other researchers like Hilary Greaves. Actually, it's funny. I've known Hilary for a long time, but I recently discovered that her name is actually pronounced Graves. I don't know why I didn't know.
No.
When we were in grad school, she was at Rutgers, I was at Princeton, so we hung out a lot. But I never knew the right pronunciation of her last name. Anyway, so when I started to learn about this interpretation, I became very afraid that it was true, because I found it to be a incredibly disturbing picture of the world, and as I just sort of outlined for you, some of the arguments in favor are extremely plausible, right? So I started to think of how I could object to it, and it was very motivated reasoning kind of thing that I try to avoid nowadays in my research. But, that was how I was at the time, right? I wanted this to be false. So I wanted to find a good argument against it.
Yeah.
But I ended up settling on an argument that I thought was a pretty good argument, which is that basically the decoherence process that I mentioned, which ensures that the different worlds are isolated from each other, that process is a probabilistic process, right? So you need some account of why it happens, why it's likely to happen, basically. There's a more precise way that I could tell you this if I wanted to talk physics jargon at you, but I'll just leave it at this.
Sure.
You have to explain why it's likely that this decoherence process will occur. But then all of the accounts of probability that the many worlds interpreters have come up with so far enter in at the level of, once you already have the isolated worlds, here's what the probability is of this world versus that world. So there's kind of a sort of circularity here, was the way that I put it.
Yeah.
Right. You need the probability account in order to get decoherence, but you need decoherence in order to get these accounts of probability.
Right. So that was the main contention that you were willing to come up with. Okay, great.
Yeah, that was that work. Yeah, I mean, that said, right, I still like the argument, but over the years, I've become more and more impressed with the arguments in favor of the many worlds interpretation. So if I had to guess which was the right interpretation now, that would honestly be my guess, even though on a kind of gut level, I don't like it, and I find it really unattractive.
Fair enough. How was your response taken at the time?
Well, so David Wallace, who's one of the absolute most remarkable people in the field, was sort of was at that time and still is kind of the godfather of the many worlds interpretation in philosophy. And I had a nice correspondence with him. He's a real Wallace is somebody who's very he's very intellectually honest. He's very secure in his beliefs usually. Like I'm not going to say I have convinced him of things actually from time to time, I feel like. But it would certainly be a tall order to convince him that the many worlds interpretation was wrong. But he does have this kind of he has a real honesty in terms of facing potential objections to his views and recognizing the strength of those objections, right? So I think he understands, in that time when we correspond, he understood the argument and found it interesting, and just at the end of the day reached, I guess, kind of the same conclusion that I was just describing for myself, which is that, it's a good argument, but there's a lot of other good arguments, and both ways about this issue. And he thinks basically maybe you could see it as a holistic picture, like the interpretation comes as one package, and yes, there's a sort of circularity involved, but if you kind of zoom out and look at all of our theoretical commitments, there are a lot of circularities in that package. So perhaps this one could be harmless, right? I think that's that's a way to respond to this that makes a lot of sense to me. I guess I would hope for a better solution, and I think he probably would hope for a better solution too. But it's, I can understand why it's not enough of an argument to shake him or other proponents of the interpretation from their views.
Sure. Well, I think it sounds like a very novel approach, and it's always interesting also to hear folks who made some arguments in the beginning and then have since changed their minds, or at least have different positions now. So doing this work at Princeton and graduate work, had this solidified your interest in going on to do philosophy of physics professionally?
Yeah, I never, once I went to grad school, I never really wavered on that.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that people who are incredibly single-minded are really lucky in life, and I have kind of turned out to be one of those people, at least where my career is concerned. So, I see friends, and I saw friends then go through with a lot of uncertainty, and I was just lucky enough to not have that. I don't want to ascribe this all to my own nature, though, because the thing about it was too, I did have a lucky position in the following sense. I was my advisor's first student, and for most of the time that I was in grad school, I was the only philosophy of physics guy in grad school at Princeton. Yeah. And then once there were others, I was the oldest and the most sort of, senior, well-prepared grad student in the area. So I didn't have this feeling that a lot of people had at Princeton who were doing work in core areas, metaphysics, epistemology, language, mind. I didn't have the feeling that a lot of them had that they were confronted day to day with people who were, just as good as them at the thing that they were doing. And I didn't have peers like that to compare myself to and think, what if I go out on the job market the same year with this person?
Yeah.
Am I, if this person is, given how good this person is, should I really take myself seriously? The only person who was like that for me was Hillary Graves. There, I said her name correctly this time. Who was at Rutgers at the time and was extremely good. And we saw each other often enough that I certainly had my moments of insecurity, thinking, oh God, Hillary and I are in the same year. What if we compete on the job market? Right.
Oh yeah.
But I got lucky in that regard, actually, as I have in many areas of life. I got lucky in that Hillary got a junior research fellowship the year before we were supposed to go out on the job market. And so she moved to Oxford, which was her sort of first home intellectually. It was where she went to university, as they would say there. Mm-hmm. And so, I was like, whew.
You don't have to compute. So right? That's really interesting. You're doing really good work, but the competition in being able to continue this in a particular position is very challenging, especially when you're competing with some of the best and brightest. So I imagine her research fellowship delayed her a year in, or was this sort of like already JRFs, kind of in the path of profession?
JRFs are this they're like postdocs, right? They're this kind of
Gotcha.
awesome. I mean, they're this awesome deal. It's basically like you get to be in the Harvard Society of Fellows. You get 3 years of pure research, right? Of course, the downside is like you get paid a fraction of what you get paid at Harvard Society of Fellows, so it's not exactly the same. But if you are a researcher, it's a really great opportunity, and it's 3 years, so I didn't have any worries that she was going to go looking for a job the year that I was looking for a job, right? Sure. Yeah.
So what happened with the job search then?
Well, yeah, that was interesting. I mean, that's so I feel like when I think about the job market the way it is these days, I just feel incredibly guilty about the experience that I had then. We always said then that the market was bad, right? This was I went out in the 07-08 academic year.
Yeah, not too long ago, actually. Yeah,
not too long ago, but right before the crash. So it was right before the housing market crash and everything. That was not yet on the radar exactly when I started going on the market, and then by the time I was interviewing for jobs, it was a real thing, but it wasn't affecting budgets yet. So yeah, money was like plentiful then. There jobs were plentiful. I mean, people would get. You would do APA interviews then, and people I knew, not everybody, of course, but so my friend Laura Bushak, of course, Laura's a star, so this is will be unsurprising to some people, but I think she had 13 APA interviews or something.
Wow.
Yeah, it was the kind of thing that would be unheard of these days. Right?
Sure. Might get a couple, might get 5 or something like that, but
yeah.
So maybe you mentioned the housing crisis and just lack of people not having as much money. I've never really gotten a good explanation as to why the market was bad then, or was relatively bad then, and now is just atrocious. Do you have a good explanation or insight as to why that is the case?
I have no understanding of the philosophy job market as a specific job market, right? Because of course, nationwide job markets generally are better now than they were right after the crash, whereas the philosophy market is much worse than it was, even in 08-09 or 2009, 2010. I don't know the answer to that.
I mean, we haven't seen. I suppose we could say that certain universities, certain departments, they're not getting extended. They're no longer extending future faculty lines. to
I don't know.
departments? I mean, certainly some, or humanities endowments are shrinking, people are staying on longer, et cetera, et cetera. I think, I mean, I certainly believe it's likely the case that the expansion, like certain departments aren't expanding, whereas others, usually in the biosciences, are certainly expanding. There's not like an interest in decreasing like bioinformatics programs or cognitive science programs, whereas in philosophy, there's not a push to build up and really, increase these departments. And it's possible that just the rate in which folks are being hired or staying on, it's just we're starting to catch up, such that it's pretty tight in terms of availability.
I'm afraid I don't have any insights to offer. It's really sad the way things are now. It's you see students who, would have been star students back. I mean, I consider them to be star students who, like, you're not sure if they're going to have to leave the field.
Yeah.
It's really, really just sad and tragic.
Well, I know there's
Oh, sorry,
go ahead.
Go on.
Well, no. I hadn't thought of this before, but I mean, I know there are cases. There's cases of a couple of philosophers who have left academia, but still continue to do academic work.
Yeah.
It's pretty difficult because you pretty much have to be able to then support yourself another way, and then also so that could be either successful authors. I'm thinking there's this one philosopher of mine, Susan Blackmore, I recall. I was studying, she did work on consciousness studies, etc. And I remember she had particularly left the field because she just didn't like the administrative work, and also happened to be a successful author, so that worked out for her. But not going to work out for everybody in that sense. But you're right. There's probably going to be a lot of students who really are very good at philosophy, but might just for lack of luck or circumstance won't find it. Is there something they can do that, is there a way to continue to do good philosophy if for whatever reason or happenstance you don't find yourself in a philosophy job?
Yeesh. I mean,
it's a tough question, but yeah.
There's a handful of examples like you mentioned, but, I mean, the person, it's sad. The person I know of who does this is a physicist named Julian Barber, who's done extremely cool work on that substantivalist relationist question. Example, right? Barber. My understanding is that I've never met him personally, but my understanding is that he's just rich, so like he can do it, right? If it's unfortunate, right? Because one would it would be sad if we ended up having a sort of over-representation of independently wealthy people in the field.
Just everyone who's just doing it as hobby or
let's hope that that's not the future. But I mean, like, I think that I suppose if you wanted to be an iBanker for the first 15 years of your career and save up money and then retire in philosophy, that'd be another path. I don't have any insights to offer except to lament the situation as it exists.
Well,
today.
it's unfortunate that it's unfortunate that one even has to ask these questions to begin with. I guess we could be so fortunate that it would be nice just to be able to focus on doing good philosophy, and then the small amount of time spending it to find work to do it. Not having to much like folks in creative industries. A lot of the times, acquiring a job or position is now kind of analogous to succeeding in Hollywood almost. Unfortunately.
It's much worse than it. Anyway, as I was saying, it's much worse than it was when I was on the job market, we thought of it as being bad then, but it really wasn't in the big scheme of things.
Okay. Well, you've been fortunate that at the time you. So, what was your first job?
My first job is the one that I have now.
Oh, fantastic. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how did how did the transition go for you from transitioning from doctoral work into your now assistant professorship?
I was one of the easiest, well, not easy, I mean, not easy labor-wise, but like emotionally easiest transitions I've ever made in my life.
Okay.
Work-wise, it was very hard. I was tired all the time, but I was loving every moment of it because I was so thankful. I was in kind of a funny position because more than a lot of people, I had a real dream job, and it was the one that I got, which is one of the other reasons why, kind of for the reason of something that we discussed at the beginning. My family's in Michigan, my roots are here, and I love Michigan kind of geographically. I love the nature and the sort of like the freshwater inland seas that we have here are like a big part of my hobbies, basically. So I really wanted to, and I went to college at the University of Michigan, and I had a good time. So it was like this emotional, sort of homeland for me. And so I really wanted, my dream was to go back to Michigan and be the successor to Larry Sklar, who was the guy that I learned philosophy of physics from.
Yeah, Larry Sklar. Yeah.
Yeah. And I knew that Larry was sort of not horribly far from retirement. So, I was thinking, I'm going to go to Michigan, right? I didn't think I was going to go to Michigan. I was like, my dream is to go to Michigan.
Sure.
I was incredibly, I don't know what to say. Like, I was incredibly kind of emotionally invested in the possibility of going to Michigan, even though I knew it was sort of a pipe dream, I guess.
Sure.
And it was funny because the year I went on the job market, Laura Ritchie and Gordon Bellett, who are two of the most awesome people in philosophy of physics, were considering senior offers from Michigan. And so I went on the job market thinking, oh, my dream is dead, right? They're just going to hire Laura and Gordon, or even if they don't, even if Laura and Gordon don't decide to move from Pittsburgh, where they were at the time, still that will kind of make it untenable for them to hire another person in philosophy of physics, right?
Yeah.
But they didn't see it that way, and Laura and Gordon kind of, didn't make a decision until my own search was already really far in the process, and so things worked out that we all three of us ended up going to the same place.
Really? Oh.
Yeah.
So they hired three?
They hired three in the same year, and so for a while we had a group of four before Larry retired.
Sure.
Now we have a group of three, so it's just the best intellectually. Right?
That's fantastic.
Yeah. So, so here I was, right? I was, I was in my first year on faculty at the place where I went to college, and I had the two dream colleagues that if I could have picked two people to be my dream colleagues, it would have been these people. Also starting with me. And, there was nothing wrong with that from my perspective. Like, I just, the teaching was incredibly hard to get used to, just, running your own course and stuff like that. Like, that was, a
lot of work.
Yeah, that was incredibly hard to get used to, but I was just loving it.
That's great.
Yeah. No, and it was great too, because I knew enough of the senior faculty that I sort of didn't feel, it's very natural as a assistant professor to feel a little bit of trepidation about how do you stand with your senior colleagues. But I kind of knew where I stood with the ones who had been my professors when I was in college, which was a fairly sized fraction of the faculty. So
that's something. And it's also been the case now that I've heard in your story that, especially with these two dream colleagues, as you describe them, that a lot of a lot of your success or your happiness in your studies has come from getting to work or discuss projects with other people. I think that's really phenomenal to hear, and I'm really going to take that to heart in pursuing my own pursuits. But I think that's important to reiterate. I know philosophy can often be it can be an isolated pursuit, and sometimes that's a good thing. We need the time to do work, but also being able to have a group of peers to discuss things with is also pretty important.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think like there's this kind of what do I want to say? There's this kind of perfect zone you can get into with having someone as a collaborator or a sort of colleague where you kind of have enough in common with your presuppositions that you can talk to each other, but you have different enough presuppositions that you can really push each other. So my advisor was like this in a way because he was very mathematical. And as I kind of mentioned early on, I'm not, So it was great for me to work with him because he was pushing me to be more mathematical and learn more of that stuff. And, my colleague Laura is like this in a different way because, well, she's also more mathematical than me and a lot like Hans. But additionally, she is more sort of, I think, kind of pragmatist, anti-realist in her sort of inclinations than I am. And we work on the same sort of type of physics, so it's kind of it's very useful to me to kind of see the way that she sees things. And she's her work had a huge influence on me from the moment that I started. Like her papers were a big part of what I was reading when I was in graduate school. So it's not as if this sort of started when we were colleagues. It's something that's been going on for my whole career.
Great. So I'm looking at some of your papers, and probably the one that has gotten the most traction was your article in BJPS, which was against field interpretations of quantum field theory. I don't know. Can you maybe say a little bit about this paper, some of the motivations for it, what any responses to it, kind of what it's about?
Yeah, that was kind of the heart and soul of my dissertation, really. Yeah. So it was, so basically, so to describe this sort of field of physics that myself, Laura Ritchie, Hans Halvorsen, a number of people kind of work on algebraic quantum field theory. So, so quantum field theory, first of all, is the physical theory that we use to predict activities of nature at kind of like a small length scale, or a high energy, which are kind of work out to be the same thing, in ways that are compatible with relativity, right? If you don't want to work in relativity, then you have ordinary quantum mechanics. But if you want to work in relativity, then you have to work on this quantum field theory. And there's something kind of new that comes in. So quantum field theory being a field theory, one of the things that it has, which is different from quantum mechanics, is it has what's called an infinite number of degrees of freedom. So, degrees of freedom are kind of basically ways that systems, kind of like coordinates that you need to keep track of in order to specify the state of a system, basically. And for a particle, you have to kind of keep track of, in classical mechanics, right, you have to kind of keep track of 6 things. You have to keep track of its kind of XYZ position, and then its XYZ velocity. Those are the things you need to know. So, so we say that system has like 3 degrees of freedom, really. Now, in field theory, you have degrees of freedom that are kind of located at every point of space. So, because there's like with the electric field, there's how strong is the field, where is it pointing at every location in space, right? Mm-hmm. So, kind of intuitively speaking, you end up with infinitely many things you have to keep track of in order to say what the state of that field is. And then when we're doing quantum electrodynamics, we treat that electromagnetic field as a quantum phenomenon, right? So we ask, what are the sort of properties of this thing at the quantum level, basically? Sure. Right. And when you have these infinitely many degrees of freedom, you can run into, you basically run into this interesting kind of multiplicity of different quantum versions of the same classical theory. So these are called unitarily inequivalent representations of the theory. And these can correspond to a lot of different kinds of things. So the type of thing that's most relevant to that field interpretations paper is sometimes different representations correspond to different ways to, in a way, kind of like think about your coordinates for the theory, right? So, for example, a kind of example of this that people talk about a lot that has real physical implications is what's called the Unruh effect, where if you are accelerating in a region that is a vacuum, we would say it's a vacuum, you will measure a non-zero temperature, or you'll detect particles in a sense, is another way to put it. Those aren't really the same thing, but there are ways of deriving that you'll see a non-zero temperature, and there are ways of deriving that you'll detect particles. So one way to think about this is there's 2 types of coordinate systems. There's the sort of inertial coordinate system where you're sitting still and moving at a constant velocity. And there's a kind of coordinate system that's accelerating, right? Mm-hmm. And those 2 coordinate systems disagree about how many particles there are, right? Just like, just like if you're standing at one location, your coordinate system disagrees about the x coordinate of something according to a coordinate system of somebody who's standing at a different location, right? Sure. You guys think that the thing is a different distance from the origin in a sense, right?
Yep.
So these two observers will feel like one of the things they will disagree about as a matter just of their coordinate systems. This is anyway a particular kind of philosophical take on this. This is the take that Hans Halvorsen and Rob Clifton defended. These 2 observers will disagree about the number of particles, and it'll just be an artifact of their different coordinate systems. So a natural thing to conclude is that the number of particles in the universe can't be a really invariant fact, right? So it has to be a kind of, we usually think of the invariant things in physics as the things that are really real, or the things that are fundamental, to kind of use a term that I was using before.
Sure.
So then people usually take this conclusion to mean that there can't be particles fundamentally in quantum field theory, right? So
given that they're not really invariant.
Yeah, given that they aren't invariant, right? And the real things are the invariant things.
Yep.
So so the purpose of that paper was to take the most natural or most obvious way of looking at quantum field theory as a theory that describes fields, right? So this is what's called the wave functional interpretation of quantum field theory, which says, we talked before about superpositions, right? The world being in a kind of combination of different states. The idea of this wave functional interpretation is that maybe what quantum field theory is saying is that the universe is in a superposition of different states of the classical fields, right? So, maybe quantum electrodynamics is telling us that rather than having a particular single classical state of the electromagnetic field, really the universe is made up out of a superposition of different states of the electromagnetic field, right? Whatever you think a superposition is. And then, if you're a many worlds person, you'll think a superposition is, well, it's different in different universes, right? But there'll be lots of different ways to spell that out. But so really this wave functional interpretation is kind of a family of different interpretations or ways of looking at it. So then my argument in that paper is that wave functional picture also depends on your choice of coordinates. In the same way, there are going to be different inequivalent representations in some situations, not for all states, but for some states, for states that are what are called coherent states. There are going to be situations where different coordinate systems will go along with inequivalent wave functional representations. And so you can't say that the wave functional field description of a state is invariant either. And so then that it must not be a field theory in that sense, right? One of the things I should emphasize, because this perhaps is one of the ways in which the paper has been, so in which rumors of the paper proving more than it proves have been a bit exaggerated.
Sure.
This isn't to say that any interpretation that you could sort of call a field interpretation is impossible. It's pointing out that the most natural way to do a field interpretation is going to run into some of the same problems as particle interpretations.
Okay.
But there are other ways to think of the quantum field theoretic world as, in a sense, describing a field. So it's not against all field interpretations of quantum field theory. This particular type.
Cool. So it sounds to me that since this paper's come out, some folks have extended it beyond perhaps what was originally intended.
Well, I mean, not in their arguments really, but you will sometimes see people cite this paper and say, the problem of ontology in quantum field theory is really doesn't have any apparent solution, or is really, impossible from what we can tell, because you can't see it as a particle theory, you can't see it as a field theory, so there's no kind of intelligible ontology. Sometimes people will sort of say something like that while citing the paper. I don't agree with that at all. I think, it's simply that the most obvious type of field ontology doesn't work out.
Yeah. Okay. So, so this was one of some of the earlier works that you had worked on. You wanted to fill us in, what kinds of things are you interested in now and perhaps excited about?
Yeah, I'm working on something awesome right now.
Please do tell. Yeah.
So I'm working on a topic that has not been covered much by philosophers of physics, although it's exploding now. There are 2 papers in the works, one of which is mine. But it's a topic that it really surprised me that people have not worked on it so far, because it's great and it's very popular with physicists, and it's super interesting philosophically. And there was a paper written decades ago that kind of showed how interesting it was philosophically, but people didn't really run with this. So it's supersymmetry is the name of it, and it's something that a lot of people have heard about it, right? So
of course, you hear it in pop physics books,
Exactly. Everybody has heard of supersymmetry, right? But if you look for philosophy papers about supersymmetry, there are none in print. And there's one paper, the one I was referring to, that sort of pointed out why it was an interesting issue for philosophy, is this paper by Robert Weingard called "A Philosopher Looks at String Theory." And this was a paper from, I think, the late 80s. So he talked a bit in that paper about supersymmetry, because supersymmetry is needed in the sort of physically realistic versions of string theory to kind of make them work.
Mm-hmm.
And what Weingard pointed out then, which is the puzzle that I'm working on, and that the other person who's writing about supersymmetry now, which I'm super excited about, is Tushar Menon, who is a DPhil candidate at Oxford, who started working on it just a little bit before I did. I started thinking about it, and then I learned of the existence of Tushar's paper, and that was when I kind of started actually writing. So the good news is that I think we have pretty different points of view on the question, so it'll be this kind of thing where we can argue with each other.
Nice.
But so what Weingard pointed out in this paper is I'll tell you. So back up, right? What is supersymmetry? Because everybody knows the name, but not everybody kind of knows what it is actually.
Yeah.
So supersymmetry is a symmetry, right? So it's one of these things where, you remember we talked before about invariance in physics.
Oops, sorry about that.
Oh,
advertisement popped up on the computer. Sorry about that. Continue with the explanation of supersymmetry.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, so that's funny. I didn't hear that.
Oh, I did. Well, sorry to interrupt.
Okay. So symmetries in physics are these people call them kind of symmetry principles or something. It's a bit of a misnomer, but the idea is that you can think of things as having symmetries in the sense that there are transformations you can perform on them that don't change anything fundamental or anything important about them. So if you look at a square, 90-degree rotations are a symmetry of the square because they just relocate, the corners of the square to the other corners of the square. They don't change anything about how the square looks, right? They don't change anything about how, if you don't paint the different corners different colors, then you're left with the same square at the end of performing that 90-degree rotation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, you also have symmetries of laws. So if I take some mechanical interaction that's happening out in space, like two asteroids collide with each other or something, I take my description of that and I rotate my perspective on those asteroids or my coordinates by 90 degrees in some direction. Then the laws are going to behave the exact same way, right? Adjusted for the difference in coordinate systems, I'll get the same predictions about what occurs in the new coordinate system as I did in the old coordinate system, right?
Mm-hmm.
This isn't true for all transformations. If I made that transformation to a situation where I was accelerating past the two asteroids, then I would see different forces, because there would be fictitious forces appearing from the fact that I was accelerating. So going from sitting still to accelerating in your coordinate system is not a symmetry.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So in supersymmetry, we say, here's another thing that's a symmetry. There's two kinds of particles in quantum physics. There's you can actually, there's situations where you can have more different kinds called paraparticles. That's another thing that I worked on a while back, which was a really cool project. But in nature, in the real world, we only have two kinds. There's bosons and there's fermions, right? The fermions are the matter particles, and the bosons are the particles that carry the forces, right? So, and those go along with two different ways of having what we call statistics, or what happens to the state when you switch particles around. But anyway, those are the two types of particles. Well, supersymmetry says that sometimes you can have a boson and a fermion, or you can have a particle basically, and you can if it's a fermion, you can transform it into a boson that has all the same properties otherwise, right? And that's a symmetry of the theory at the fundamental level. Okay.
These bosons, yeah, okay.
So now we're not talking about transforming the bosons we know into the fermions we know, right? It's not that the theory is saying I can take a proton, or, well, I should talk about a fundamental one. It's not saying I can take an electron and turn it into a photon or something, right? I can't take an electron and turn it into a light particle. What it is saying is that there is a boson partner of the electron, which people call the selectron. And there's a fermion partner of the photon, which is called the photino. And at the fundamental level, transforming the photon into the photino doesn't change anything. Now, in real life, of course, we don't see a bunch of photinos going around. And in real life, if there were a photino around, you could tell the difference between that and a photon. The reason for that is because supersymmetry is what we call spontaneously broken symmetry in the real world. So, like, so basically the forces. Here's a way to an example of spontaneously broken symmetry that people are kind of familiar with is magnetism, right? So the laws of electricity and magnetism are invariant under rotations, right?
Sure.
But if I look at a ferromagnet, that thing is going to have a north pole and a south pole, right? The reason for this is that the physical laws make it so that the lowest energy state available to a bunch of sort of iron atoms that are sitting in a bar somewhere, the lowest energy state available to those atoms is if they all have their spins point in the same way, and so they have that generates a magnetic field around the bar and gives it a north pole and a south pole.
Okay.
Right. So similarly, in supersymmetry, it turns out that the masses of the particles are different at different temperatures. And in supersymmetry, basically, the lowest energy state or the lowest temperature state is one where the bosons have different mass from their fermion partners, and vice versa. So the electron is a lot less massive than the selectron, its boson partner, and so it's really hard to find particles that are much more massive because it takes a lot of energy to generate them. So that's why we don't see selectrons. Okay, so that's supersymmetry, but one of the things that Weingard noticed is the way that physicists often work with supersymmetry, especially the particle theorists who work with it most often, is that they actually write it up in a different kind of space-time from the one that we normally use. So they write up this new space-time called superspace. It's sometimes called super Minkowski space.
Okay.
And this superspace has these extra coordinates in it, which are they're weird coordinates because they're not real number valued like ordinary dimensions in space, right? They're not like the real numbers. They are their values are what we call Grassmann anti-commuting numbers. So they're numbers where like A times B doesn't always equal B times A.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So those extra super coordinates, if you add those to space-time, then you can treat supersymmetry, the transformations that take you from one of these bosons to one of these fermions, you can treat it as what we call a translation, which is moving the origin of your coordinate system.
Okay.
So it's kind of like these particles have a location which is the boson location, and you can move them. You can change your coordinates so that what you were thinking of as the boson location now gets counted as the fermion location.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Now, obviously, there's a huge philosophical question here because how do we understand this superspace, right?
Yeah.
Is this the space that we live in? Assuming, I mean, supersymmetry is not proven, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, got to actually find some empirical evidence in favor of it. But if they do find some of that evidence in favor of it and we come to accept the theory as true, then you'd have this huge puzzle, right? Do we live in this superspace? Because you can write the theory in regular space-time. It's a little more annoying to work with it.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can write it in superspace, right? So there's this huge kind of ontology problem here. Which of these two types of space-time is the space-time that we exist in if reality is supersymmetric?
So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so before I tell you what I think, I have to tell you the connection here. Let me. So basically, I'm not 100% sure what I think yet. Actually,
that's fair.
But let me tell you the connection that this has with a cool debate that already exists in the philosophy of space and time. So Eleanor Knox of wait, Eleanor's at King's? Is that? It's funny. I'm blanking on her location, but she went to grad school at Oxford. So she has this really cool project, which is kind of an alteration of a view, or a sort of, I think, big improvement of a view that Harvey Brown has defended. Basically, her view is we have this kind of semantic question which arises in the substantivalism and relationism debate as well. What counts as space-time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I give you some, mathematical structure, I give you some theory, there's a question we can ask: which of the things in this theory, which of the sort of mathematical entities in this theory describe the space-time, and which ones describe the matter, right?
Yeah.
And which of the quantities in the theory are spatiotemporal quantities, and which of the symmetries in the theory are space-time symmetries? That's another way to ask the question, right? And her view is that we have a concept of space-time which is a functional concept. So her view, she calls her view space-time functionalism.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like functionalism about the mind in a way, right? The idea is that there's no special essence of what it is to be space-time. There's no kind of like metaphysical essence to that. Really, whatever does the work that space-time does in the laws is the thing that we'll count as space-time. That's what our concept. It's how our concept of space-time works.
Yeah.
Right. And so Tushar Menon, who is working on the issue too, as I mentioned, his view, at least his tentative view right now, he's still working on his project as well. But his tentative view is that if you understand this functionalist view right, the space-time function is being fulfilled by superspace in the case of supersymmetry, and not by regular space-time. Right. Now, in the end, I think I probably agree with that, but the kind of view that I'm developing is a little bit different from basically I kind of agree that superspace is probably space, but for different reasons, because I like the kind of basic idea of this functionalist view, but I think that really the people who put it forward, including Knox, have been very focused on finding kind of a particular set of necessary and sufficient conditions for being space-time. And I tend to think that our space-time concept is more like a cluster concept. You know, like your concept of dog. Well, It doesn't need to have 4 legs to be a dog, but having 4 legs sort of counts. That it gives you extra dog points, and if you earn enough dog points, then you count as being a dog, right?
Sure.
To put it that way. So I tend to think there are a lot of different things that we think of as the role of space-time. And in the case of supersymmetry, it really is the case that some of these break down in favor of regular space, and some of these break down in favor of superspace. Right. And I actually think one of the main points of my paper, which I think Tushar would disagree with, I think Menon would disagree with me about this. One of the main points I want to have is that you actually need to answer the question of, are you going to be a substantivalist about superspace before you can answer the question of whether superspace is what we should call space-time, right? Because I think one of the things that fits into that cluster concept of space-time is that space-time is pretty fundamental.
Yes.
Right. And remember, I was saying my preferred view of what it is to be a substantivalist is you're a substantivalist if you think that space-time is fundamental. Right.
That's right.
So the question of whether superspace is fundamental is going to have to be answered before you can answer the question of whether we should count it as space-time.
Okay. So this is the central position of one of the papers?
Yeah, at least that's where I'm tending now. I mean, don't kill me if it comes out in print and I defend something completely different, but
that's fair.
That's what I'm tending towards at the moment. I'm
gonna have to start reading more philosophy of physics. I myself, this sounds fascinating to me, and I think especially your explanation in terms of the way in which you conceptually understand these ideas and how they relate with one another, I think paints a really good picture of the kind of work that philosophers of physics get to do. So
one of the types of work that we get to do.
One of the types of work that you get to do. Yeah.
As I was kind of alluding to before, right? I am a little more metaphysical than a lot of philosophers of physics.
Okay.
And I think that goes for some of the people I'm engaging with here. At least Knox, I think, has some interest in metaphysics. Although, I think she's more skeptical than I am. You don't find anybody who's less skeptical than I am in philosophy of physics, I think. But there's lots of other. I mean, there's a lot of people who are, I think. A lot of people who are doing work that's much closer to what scientists and mathematical physicists do, and that's exciting stuff too. It's just I can't do that, saying, right? I'm not a math prodigy like some people.
Sure, I understand. No, I understand that very well. Well, that sounds really exciting. We'll be looking out for those papers. Any idea where you'll be sending them?
Well, the supersymmetry paper looks like it might turn out a bit long, so that seems like it might be a good paper for British Journal for the Philosophy of Science because they take long papers.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be my guess.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Great. Well, yeah, so we're coming to the end a little bit of our interview, but there's a couple more things I wanted to get at, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing, and something that I've been asking a lot of the guests on the show, and as a philosopher of physics, you might have an interesting take, is just what are some of the challenges, the biggest challenges facing philosophers of science today?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that some of the challenges that face philosophers of science in general are things that we're a bit insulated from in philosophy of physics, actually, because, it seems to me that, well, there's so much, it's unfortunate in a way that we're insulated from these things because it means that there are some of the most important issues in the world are things that we don't get to work on in philosophy of physics. Sure. In a way, that's kind of a relief, but so in lots of fields of science, there's these issues about, replication crises and politicized science and stuff like this.
Yeah, they kind of affect many of the sciences.
Yeah, exactly. So those don't come up so much in physics, right? There's no replication crisis in physics. So those kind of things, I think. I get scared and I get excited at the prospects for philosophy of science as a whole, looking at these questions, because I think they are some of the hardest and most important questions of our time. So I think, unfortunately, since my focus is physics, I'm not especially qualified myself to work on these things, but if there were somebody who was sort of starting out in philosophy of science and was interested in other areas of science, I think it's so important to get people in philosophy of science working on these issues. Mm-hmm. Of course they are already, a lot of them, but more even, because I think these are super important issues. In philosophy of physics, I think in that case, the challenge in philosophy of physics is, I'm not going to say staying relevant, because I think philosophy of physics is relevant in the ways that matters, but maintaining the kind of appearance or atmosphere of relevance is going to be really important, because, a lot of the issues that are coming up in other fields of science, the biological sciences, the social sciences, those issues are ones that really do, bear on the great kind of cultural conflict questions of our age, right? They're questions that you get into when you start arguing politics.
Yep.
And which is what everybody's doing in 2017 so far. So the challenge for philosophy of physics, I think, is just going to be keeping people's interest in these fundamental questions about what reality is like at the smallest scales and the most zooming out to the broadest scales, right? Keeping people interested in those questions when there are such pressing and in many cases highly kind of like life impacting questions that people can focus on, in other sciences, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a huge,
So how do you do that? So is this something that you're actively considering yourself, or
Well, the good news is that I think I don't think there's any dearth of interest in fundamental science and metaphysics in philosophy now.
No.
Right. I do foresee so one thing that's happening in a lot of the core areas of philosophy is that people in philosophy of language and metaphysics are working on what some people are calling social and political philosophy of language and metaphysics. So my colleague Eric Swanson teaches a course on social and political philosophy of language, where the course is about slurs and presuppositions of political presuppositions, ideological presuppositions that enter into discussion and stuff like that. And a lot of metaphysicians are working on metaphysical issues about social categories and stuff like that. There's no possibility for philosophers of physics to work on those kind of questions, right? At least, the only possibility you might see is if philosophers of physics went down the sort of, Bloor and Barnes, it's all a social construction. Oh,
sorry. My wife has just brought the corgis home, and sorry about that. Hold on one second.
No.
Hold on one moment. Okay, sorry about that. I just had to close the door. You might hear them in the background a little bit. But
okay,
continue.
All right, well,
sorry.
Yeah. So a lot of metaphysicians and philosophers of language are working on sort of social and political questions, and there's simply no way for philosophers of physics to do anything that focuses on that unless they adopt a view which I find completely untenable, which is the view that physics is a social construction in some sense, or has a large element of social construction to it. I just don't believe that, and I don't think many people who are well acquainted with physics are ever going to believe it, because I just think there's so many reasons counting against it, basically. Whereas, there's an excellent argument to be made that there's a lot of social construction of categories and stuff like that in the social sciences or the biological sciences, right? So I think that philosophers of physics have a delicate line to toe, because I'm going to have to keep beating the drum for work on sort of purely unapplied research about reality at the smallest scales, while respecting the fact that there are lots of excellent reasons to do research about social categories, and that it would be a tragedy if people didn't do that kind of research, right?
Mm-hmm. So maintaining the interest in both, and ideally, I think you're right also that it doesn't seem like there's going to be a lack of interest in fundamental reality and all other kinds of questions that most philosophers of physics tend to be interested in.
I think that's right, and also great thing about philosophy of physics is that it just tends to attract people. Like, there is this kind of story that is often a bit like my story, where people are interested in physics, but they have questions that are more abstract than what their physics faculty are kind of interested in looking at, or they find that their talents are stronger in philosophy, So there's a kind of pipeline of people who are interested in it, and there's a lot of great research in the field. So I think on the merits, I say this is a challenge because I was sort of fishing for something to talk about when you asked what are the challenges, but
sure.
I don't see anything. I don't see things going bad, just because the quality of the research in philosophy of physics is so great, I think, that on the merits, it's just going to remain interesting to philosophers because philosophers like, good research.
Good. Oh, this is fantastic. It's really good to hear some positive optimism, especially regarding a particular particular side of philosophy of science. There's a lot of issues. Other challenges we faced is if folks have been concerned of the hyper specialization in the philosophy of science, or disconnect from more traditional analytic philosophy. People go both ways on that. People want a little bit more philosophy. Some people want less philosophy. People want to do more like philosophy in service of the science. So it's just interesting to see a variety of folks in these different fields. And it's certainly clear that if you're doing philosophy of science and in some capacity, you might be doing very different things.
I think on that issue, like my own preference is for more philosophy rather than less or something. It's a bit of an interesting way to put it, but definitely more engagement with what we think of or what people call core philosophy, quote unquote. But honestly, though, like I love being in a field with a lot of people who disagree with that approach and want to try to tear it down because, I was just at a conference having a great conversation with a colleague who thinks that all metaphysics is a waste of time, and it was that's a common
position I hear.
I would never want people like that to disappear from philosophy of physics or shut up about their views because their views are incredibly useful, even though I disagree with them.
Do you find that, when folks take the positions strongly against metaphysics, that there's a more, what is the real disagreement come down to in terms of like, what are the general assumptions that they're basing this claim on?
I think that a lot of philosophers of science, basically disagree with me or, have kind of basically disagree with me about how easy it is to be a realist at all without being a full-blown metaphysical realist. Right. So I take the exchange between this is what I was actually talking about with my colleague at this conference recently. It's something I've had kind of be in my bonnet about lately. But I take the exchange between Putnam and Lewis surrounding the model theoretic argument, what Lewis called Putnam's paradox. Mm-hmm. I take that exchange to have established, to my satisfaction, that if you want to accept that empirically inequivalent theories can be inequivalent in their content, you have to be a pretty robust metaphysical realist and believe in a distinction between fundamental facts and non-fundamental facts.
Okay.
So I think a lot of people kind of don't accept that line of reasoning for whatever reason. But to me, it looks pretty unshakable. So I guess I would say one thing I would say to philosophers of science who are sort of anti-metaphysics is, take a look at Putnam's model theoretic argument and Lewis's paper, Putnam's paradox, and tell me why you disagree with Lewis's take on that, on that disagreement. Mm-hmm. And one of the great things actually about this discussion that I was having with Eric Curiel at this conference, my colleague, is that he was steeped in those papers and had a really interesting disagreement with them. But yeah, I think that's that's one of the, also another thing I think that philosophers of science can get a bit hung up on is this idea that questions need to be answerable, or that you need to, meaningful questions need to be ones that we can collect data
Sure.
that will sort of decide the questions. That seems unlikely to me. Like, one thing that seems highly likely to me is, well, humans are, a variety of animal. All the other animal species have all kinds of questions that they can't answer, right? And they have no way of collecting evidence that's relevant to the questions. Like, like dogs can't do algebraic geometry, and they can't possibly, they probably can't possibly even entertain the questions, but they certainly can't collect any evidence that's relevant to those questions. That doesn't mean those questions are meaningless, or that there's no fact of the matter about what the theorems of algebraic geometry are. It just means that this particular species is not in a position to collect good evidence about it. And I think with a lot of questions like, is reality made up, is our properties universals or tropes or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. I think, that could very well be a meaningful question. It's just that we're not in a position to collect any evidence, or the evidence we have. One thing that Ted Sider is a great metaphysician who I think is a really useful figure to read for philosophers of physics, especially because he talks to a lot of philosophers of physics, and I think he has a lot of useful engagement with points of view from philosophy of physics. But Sider often says the evidence we have in metaphysics is really weak evidence. That doesn't mean it's not evidence and you can't sort of make worthwhile arguments in metaphysics. It's just that maybe you should end up with something like a 55 or 60% credence in the views that you defend, right? If you believe, and I tend to believe, that the non-empirical theoretical virtues give us reasons to believe something for real, like, Occam's razor is a real principle of reasoning. That seems right to me. It's like, of course, Occam's razor is really weak evidence in the absence of any empirical data. Mm-hmm. Because God, how many times has the nicer looking theory turned out to be false? Very frequently in the history of physics, even, which is, the place where Occam's razor has been the most successful. Sure. But it's not nothing, right? It's a bit of evidence. It's a bit of reason to believe something, I think. So, yeah. That's my point of view, I guess.
Cool. No, I appreciate that. I hope some folks are listening and can maybe respond. But I'm happy to share some of those positions and look at them a bit more closely myself. Last thing I wanted to touch on is I noticed on your this is outside a bit of philosophy of physics, but I noticed on your homepage you have a section for philosophy and you have a section for fiction.
Right.
Yeah. So you said you write short stories, science fiction stories.
Yeah.
Cool. So what? Just I don't know. I mean, obviously, I imagine this relates somewhat to your work in physics. But could you tell me a little bit about that and what motivated you and how that's going?
Well, it's almost right. Yeah. So I would say that my science fiction fandom is one of the things that kind of fed into my love of philosophy, really, because if you read a lot of science fiction, which I did growing up, my dad got me into it from a young age. I saw Star Wars before I can remember. Like, I can't remember the first time I saw Star Wars. And of course, like, when I started reading like real hardcore science fiction, like that kind of, a lot of philosophers read Greg Egan and Ted Chiang. I love those authors. So you get really used to considering interesting, wild hypotheticals, right? And that was probably one of the things that got me into philosophy. But yeah, now I think it's a lot more of the philosophy feeding the writing. So the most recent thing that I published, which is a while ago now, it's very hard to publish stories in science fiction. You know, you think about the acceptance rates at the best philosophy journals. They're lower. They have much higher acceptance rates than the science fiction magazines. I'll tell you that.
Oh wow.
So you know, it's just the competition is incredible, and you know, I'm still learning. Right, people. Sure. It takes a lifetime to learn that skill, but yeah, the last thing that I published was sort of a story about this alien species that evolved so that they had to. They couldn't survive growing up without this nutrient that they could only get from another intelligent species that also evolved on their planet.
Mm-hmm.
So they would just die if they were vegetarians, and in fact, if they didn't eat these other sentient beings, they would just die, right? And so they developed this theory of consciousness, conveniently according to which these beings that they were eating didn't have phenomenal consciousness in the sort of Dave Chalmers sense, the Ned Block sense, right? There was nothing it was like to be the beings that they were eating, and so it was okay to cause them all this pain, right? They, you know, and to kill them. There was nothing wrong with that because they were just zombies, as we would say in philosophy, right?
Sure.
So, yeah. So you know, I kind of got there by thinking, of course, about consciousness, right? But also about these kind of things I was just talking about, these kind of scientific rationalization. How can politics and your sort of presuppositions come into your science, right? And how can science sort of deceive us about fraught questions? So that was kind of, you know, and yeah, a lot of my stuff focuses on physics questions. You know, usually I come up with some kind of crazy made up physics. I don't write a lot of stories that are set in the real world.
Sure. Well, so why do you do that? Is that for your own general interest, or is that tends to be what makes good science fiction?
Yeah, I think that what it is that I think what it is that I like a particular kind of epic story that takes place in space. And, you know, like with like giant space battleships fighting each other as part of it anyway. And it's extremely hard to make that kind of a story make sense given the physics that we have in the real world. Mm-hmm. So if I want to keep myself excited about the work I'm doing, I have to write the kind of stories that I like to read. And the kind of stories that I like to read are these real space epics, which, you know, maybe we'll get to the stars someday, but in real life, we're never going to have giant battleships out in space, right? That's a silly trope, but it's a trope that I love.
Very nice. Well, I'm excited to see. I'll have to check through or skim through some of your articles. I had no idea it was so difficult to publish in science fiction. Some of these magazines, but I imagine it's a pretty popular
there's so
field.
Many people who want to write.
Yeah.
It's, you know, like philosophy, we get a lot of talent, but a pretty small number of people comparatively competing for publication. Whereas in fiction, everybody wants to be a fiction writer,
of course, and science fiction too, which is like
super
fun.
Yeah. It's cool stuff.
All right, Dave. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share about, you know, your origin story, your interesting insights on your past and current research, as well as your thoughts on philosophy of physics. Is there anything else that you wanted to share with us toward the end? Any discussions, plugging new work or graduate program or something?
Oh, I mean, well, you know, of course, we have a fantastic graduate program.
That's something I wanted. I wanted to ask. So, like, I know. I mean, University of Michigan. It's, you know, Harvard of the Midwest. There is a very good, people speak very highly of Michigan. What is it? What do you like about the program that you guys are running there?
Well, I mean, I firmly believe that a graduate program is first and foremost kind of made or broken by the students, and we just get amazing students. It's kind of,
Fantastic.
they say that becomes a self-fulfilling kind of thing where you get good students and they get more good students to show up. So it's, but I think that in philosophy of science, we have a great faculty to student ratio. We have so many philosophers of physics. It's kind of, even if we admitted and attracted basically every grad student who wants to do philosophy of physics every year, we probably wouldn't with three of us, we probably wouldn't overpower our capacity to advise students well. So it's if you come to Michigan for philosophy of physics, you really get 3 faculty members all to yourself, basically.
Really?
Not all. We basically, things work out so that we have about 1 student a year in philosophy of physics. And so,
are you guys one of the leading programs in philosophy of physics? I imagine.
I mean, not to toot my own horn, right? But like, you get like a fighter or whatever. So our most recent PhD in philosophy of physics, Chip Sebens, he just got a paper in the Philosopher's Annual, right?
Yeah.
He's tenure track at UCSD. Our philosophy of science PhD, Dimitri Gallo, is tenure track at Pittsburgh. So,
wow,
things are, yeah. But we've, I feel like we haven't been there that long. Laura Gordon and I have been there for about 10 years, but we are starting to definitely place people the way that one would hope with such a large group. So
very nice, very nice.
Yeah.
Well, I'll certainly keep that in mind for folks, doing the MA over in Indiana here, or folks interested in physics to consider applying to Michigan, or if any of our listeners who are, prospective students are interested, or at least I don't know, do you ever do any visiting talks or anything, or hold conferences out there?
Yeah, we have an annual, this is a way in which our grad students are amazing, because they almost single-handedly run so Michigan has a lot of, as with a lot of universities, there's money everywhere for interdisciplinary activities. And one of the things we have are these Rackham Graduate School interdisciplinary workshops, where we have a reading group that meets all year round, basically, during the academic year, and sometimes in the summer, depending on if people are in town. But that leads up to our annual Foundations of Modern Physics workshop. So we've had a bunch of conferences so far. We had the first one was on quantum field theory. The second one was on the philosophy of general relativity. Yada yada. There've been several conferences, the most recent one was on the philosophy of cosmology.
Wow.
So it's a long-standing enough tradition that I think it's pretty much baked into the program at this point. So we have that, and we have a talk series called Philosophy of Science at Cedra, or POSE, which was Bellett and Ritchie both like funny sort of names for things. So it was I think it was Gordon's idea, was POSE. So we bring in people, we bring in a lot of recent PhDs to give talks at POSE. There's a lot of great philosophy of physics in the Midwest, at Notre Dame and in the Chicago area. So it's easy to sort of find people who are interested in coming to give a talk. So, lots of cool stuff.
Great. And, that sounds wonderful. And so I imagine rest of the summer doing anything fun at staying much longer at the family's home?
A little while, yeah. I mean, I keep telling myself I'm going to go to the Upper Peninsula and spend a week with my uncle who lives there.
Oh, cool.
So I think I'll do that this summer. I've been meaning to do that for a couple of years, so that should be a cool trip.
All right. Well, I really hope you have a great rest of the summer. I think it's wonderful getting some time off to vacation and research at the same time. But still connect with family and stuff. I think that's an ideal situation. You're making Michigan sound more appealing by the minute. So,
all right.
Well, thank you, Dave. Again, it's been a real pleasure, and we'll let you know when the episode comes out, and be in touch.
All right. Thanks so much, Nick.
All right. Have a good rest of the day, Dave. I'll talk to you soon.
Great talking to you. Take care.
Bye.